The oak-paneled courtroom was packed, the tension thick in the air. Rows of people filled the wooden benches, whispering in hushed tones as they waited for the proceedings to begin. The case had drawn unusual attention, not because of the severity of the crime, but because of who the defendant was. Seated at the defendant's table, Elijah Carter, a 12-year-old black boy, sat uncomfortably in the oversized chair. His small frame barely filled the seat, his feet unable to touch the floor. He wore a faded hoodie, the sleeves slightly too long, and scuffed sneakers that told a silent story of wear and struggle. His hands, small but tense, gripped the edge of the table as if anchoring himself against the weight of the moment. Across the room, Judge Meredith Lawson adjusted her glasses as she flipped through the case file in front of her. In her late 40s, she was known as a woman of precision, order, and unwavering discipline. She had built her reputation on a no-nonsense approach to the law, particularly when it came to youth offenders. She didn't see troubled kids. She saw cases, facts, and sentencing guidelines. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. All rise for the Honorable Judge Meredith Lawson. The shuffle of people standing momentarily drowned out the nervous beat of Elijah's heart. He felt the weight of the courtroom pressing in on him. The prosecutors, the jury, the strangers in the gallery, and most of all, the woman seated high above him in her black robe. "You may be seated," Judge Lawson announced, her voice clipped and professional. The crowd sat. Her sharp eyes moved from the paperwork to the small boy at the defendant's table. For a split second, a flicker of something passed across her face. Curiosity, recognition, or maybe just the natural instinct to take in the face of the accused. But whatever it was, she quickly buried it beneath years of practiced neutrality. She cleared her throat. "This case involves charges of trespassing and loitering," she stated. "Defendant, you are accused of entering private property without permission. How do you plead?" The courtroom fell silent, waiting for Elijah's response. The public defender, a tired-looking man in a wrinkled suit, leaned down and whispered something to Elijah, his voice low and hurried, probably urging him to answer. Elijah didn't reply. He didn't even seem to hear him. His eyes were locked on Judge Lawson. Something about her face, her voice, her presence was pulling at something deep inside of him. His breath quickened, his chest rising and falling in the uneven waves. His mind raced. Could it really be her? Was this really happening? Judge Lawson noticed his stare, her brows knit together, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "Defendant, is there something you'd like to say?" she asked, her tone edged with impatience. Elijah's fingers curled tighter around the table's edge. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The words were stuck, tangled in his throat, too heavy to push out. The judge sighed. "If you're not going to speak, let's move on. You're my mom." The words came shakily, but loud enough to echo through the silent courtroom. For a moment, the world stopped. The murmurs started slowly, whispers rolling through the room like an unexpected wave. Someone in the back gasped audibly, and a reporter's pen scratched furiously across a notepad. At the judge's bench, Meredith Lawson went completely still. Her hand, which had been holding a pen above her notes, froze in place. The ink tip hovered above the paper, unmoving. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She blinked. Did she hear him correctly? Elijah swallowed hard, his small hands trembling on the table. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, but there was a quiet certainty in them, a desperate kind of knowing. Judge Lawson's fingers tensed around her pen. Her throat felt dry, her heart an unsteady rhythm in her chest. "What did you just say?" she asked, though the words barely came out. Elijah's voice cracked as he repeated himself, softer but even more certain. "You're my mom." A new wave of gasps swept the room. Someone whispered, "What did he just say?" The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence, his mouth still open, but his mind seemingly frozen. The bailiff exchanged a confused glance with the public defender, who looked just as blindsided as everyone else. Anne Meredith, she just stared. The courtroom, usually a place of strict order, had become completely unhinged in a matter of seconds. She studied the boy's face, her mind racing. This had to be a mistake, had to be. And yet, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her chest, the strange familiarity in his wide brown eyes. She finally forced herself to speak. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice clipped, trying to regain control. But something in her carefully constructed composure had cracked, and Elijah saw it. The boy's lips trembled, but he pushed forward, voice breaking as tears spilled onto his cheeks. "You gave me away when I was a baby. My foster mom told me everything." The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in. Judge Lawson's breath hitched, her grip on the bench tightening, as the weight of his words slammed into her. She glanced at the bailiff, then at the public defender, both of whom were still frozen in place. She had spent decades in control, decades building her life on the foundation of law and logic. And now, with just 3 words, everything she had built was crumbling. Her voice came out in a whisper, fragile in a way no one had ever heard before. I need a moment." And then, before anyone could process what had just happened, she stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her vision blurred, her chest tightened. She turned and walked out. Behind her, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Meredith Lawson moved quickly, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors as she pushed through the heavy doors leading to her chambers. Her breath was shallow, her heartbeat a relentless drum against her ribs. "Recess," she had managed to say before leaving the courtroom, but the word had barely made it out. It had sounded weak, foreign, so unlike her usual commanding tone. She didn't stop walking until she reached the safety of her private office. The moment the door shut behind her, she locked it. And then she exhaled. It was sharp, unsteady. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the cool surface of her desk, gripping the edge as if she needed it to keep herself upright. "You're my mom." The words echoed loud and clear in her mind, refusing to fade. She shook her head, as if doing so would somehow erase what had just happened. But it was real. He was real. She closed her eyes, but instead of darkness, she saw memories. Unwanted, buried memories. Flooding back like a dam had broken. 18 years ago. She was 18, terrified, and alone. The house smelled like freshly brewed coffee and old books, but there was nothing comforting about it that day. Her father sat stiffly in his chair, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. Her mother stood by the window, arms crossed, her lips a thin line of disapproval. Anne Meredith, she sat on the couch, her hands cradling the barely there swell of her stomach, wishing she could disappear. "This is not up for debate," her father had said, his voice as cold as the December wind outside. "You are going to give that baby up." Her mother finally turned to face her, her expression full of thinly veiled disgust. "You think you can raise a child?" she had scoffed. "You have a scholarship to law school, Meredith. Do you want to throw that away for a mistake?" The word mistake had cut deep. Her parents had already arranged everything. The agency, the paperwork, the future of a baby. She hadn't even had a chance to hold yet. Her voice had been small when she asked, "What if I change my mind?" Her father's gaze had hardened. "You won't." And just like that, her fate had been sealed. Meredith gasped as she snapped back to the present. She pressed a shaking hand to her forehead, trying to steady herself, but her knees felt weak. She had spent years pretending that part of her life didn't exist. She had told herself she had done the right thing, and yet, here he was, the child she gave up, the child she had abandoned, sitting in her courtroom, calling her mom. A sharp knock at the door made her jolt. "Judge Lawson?" It was Linda Foster, the social worker assigned to Elijah's case. Meredith hesitated before answering, forcing her voice into its usual professional tone. "Not now." Linda was silent for a moment. Then, a softer voice came through the door. "I know this is hard," Linda said, "but there's a boy sitting out there who's been waiting for you his whole life." Meredith clenched her jaw. Waiting for her? She didn't even know he existed until 10 minutes ago. How could he have been waiting for her? She turned away from the door, rubbing her temples. Meanwhile, back in the courtroom, Elijah sat at the defense table, his head lowered. The weight of what he had just done pressed against his small shoulders like a crushing force. Linda sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his back. "You okay, kid?" she asked softly. Elijah didn't respond right away. His eyes were fixed on the table, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing invisible patterns on the wood. "I don't know," he finally whispered. Linda sighed. "That was a big thing you just did." Elijah nodded. He had spent months, years, really, wondering about his mother. He had memorized her name from an old photograph his last foster mother had shown him. He had imagined meeting her 1,000 times. But not like this. Not with her looking at him like he was a stranger. Not with her walking out on him. His chest tightened, and he blinked quickly, trying to keep the tears from falling. Linda squeezed his shoulder. She's probably just processing. Elijah let out a shaky breath. She doesn't want me, he mumbled. Linda's heart ached at the pain in his voice. I don't think that's true, she said. I think she's just scared. The courtroom was still buzzing. Reporters were scribbling furiously in their notepads, some already stepping out to make phone calls, no doubt spreading the story like wildfire. A judge, a well-respected, no-nonsense judge, had just been publicly accused of being the birth mother of the very child she was presiding over. It was a scandal in the making. Across the room, the prosecutor and Elijah's public defender exchanged glances. Neither of them knew what to do next. How do you continue a case when the judge has just been accused of abandoning the defendant as a baby? Linda sighed, rubbing her temples. She had known Elijah for years. She had seen him shuffled from home to home, disappointment after disappointment. And now, the one person he had spent his whole life wondering about had just walked away from him. She turned to him again, her voice gentle. Elijah, listen to me. This isn't over. He didn't say anything, but his hands curled into fists in his lap. Linda watched him carefully, then glanced toward the judge's empty chair. No, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Judge Meredith Lawson sat at her desk, her fingers pressed against her temples as she tried to steady her breathing. The silence of her chambers should have been calming, a reprieve from the chaos outside, but instead, it felt suffocating. The echo of Elijah's voice still rang in her ears. You're my mom. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the bottom drawer of her desk. It had been years since she had even touched the small wooden box inside, but she knew exactly what she was looking for. She pulled it open, her breath catching as she saw it, the tattered photograph she had buried beneath case files and old documents. Her hands shook as she lifted it, her thumb brushing over the worn edges. A newborn, wrapped in a faded yellow blanket, his tiny face scrunched in sleep. Her chest tightened painfully. It had been the only picture she had ever kept of him. For years, she had told herself she had done the right thing, that she had made the only choice she could. She had convinced herself that he had gone to a loving home, that he had been raised by parents who could give him what she never could at 18. But now she knew the truth. He had been in foster care his entire life. Her fingers curled around the photo as a bitter taste rose in her throat. She had abandoned him to a system that had failed him. A knock at the door shattered her thoughts. She inhaled sharply, shoving the photo back into the drawer before straightening her posture. Come in, she called, her voice colder than she intended. The door opened and Linda Foster stepped inside, closing it quietly behind her. The social worker stood with a quiet strength, her eyes filled with concern and frustration. Judge Lawson, she began carefully, I think we need to talk. Meredith stiffened. This is not the time. Linda's expression didn't waver. With all due respect, this is exactly the time. Meredith clenched her jaw. She had known Linda for years. The woman was tough, relentless when it came to advocating for children. But right now, Meredith wasn't just a judge. She was the subject of that advocacy. And that made her deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Linda stepped closer, her voice gentler now. Elijah has been in the system since he was a baby, bounced from home to home, let down over and over again. Meredith swallowed hard, but said nothing. And now, Linda continued, he's finally found you, and you walked away. A sharp, stinging guilt settled in Meredith's stomach. I am his judge, she said evenly, though the words felt fragile. Not his mother. Linda's lips pressed into a thin line. That's not how he sees it. Meredith turned away, rubbing a hand over her face. I can't do this. I can't just... Linda cut her off. You already did, Meredith. You left him once. Are you really going to do it again? Meredith's breath caught. The words hit harder than she was prepared for. She had spent so long convincing herself that giving him up had been an act of love, that it had been the best decision for both of them. But was it? Had she ever really checked? Had she ever followed up, made sure he was okay? Number. because it was easier to believe he was fine than to face the possibility that he wasn't. She took a deep breath, her voice quiet but firm. This case must proceed as a legal matter, not a personal one. Linda exhaled, clearly frustrated. Fine, let's talk legal then. Meredith frowned, wary. What do you mean? Linda crossed her arms. Elijah was arrested for trespassing. You and I both know why he was there. He was looking for you. He wasn't vandalizing, he wasn't stealing, he wasn't hurting anyone. And now, he's sitting in that courtroom, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement from the only person in the world who should have given it to him years ago. Meredith's throat tightened. I can't get personally involved in a case. Linda's voice softened. I'm not asking you to break the law, Meredith. I'm asking you to be human. Meredith didn't reply. She couldn't. After a long pause, Linda sighed and moved toward the door. He deserves better than this, she said before stepping out. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Meredith alone in the silence of her chambers once more. Back in the courtroom, Elijah sat in the same oversized chair, staring down at the table in front of him. His hands were balled into fists in his lap, his jaw tight. She had left. Again. He shouldn't have expected anything different. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, the whispers still buzzing, reporters still scribbling, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the empty judge's chair at the front of the room. His lawyer cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. We'll take a short break until the judge returns. Elijah didn't move. Linda returned to his side, her face unreadable, but he could tell. She had tried, and it hadn't worked. He inhaled sharply, his fingers curling tighter around the fabric of his hoodie. He had imagined this moment so many times. He had dreamed of finding her, of looking into her face and knowing where he came from. He had hoped, deep down, for something, anything, that might make him feel less invisible. But instead, she had walked away. And that hurt more than anything. More than the foster homes, more than the rejections, more than the nights spent wondering if she had ever thought of him. His eyes stung, but he refused to cry. Not here, not in front of them. She didn't want him. And maybe she never had. The courthouse emptied slowly as the day came to an end. But Elijah Carter didn't move. He sat in the same chair he had been in for hours, staring at the polished wood of the defense table, his hands clasped tightly together. Linda Foster stood beside him, watching him carefully. The weight of the day hung between them, the accusation, the rejection, the silence that followed. She crouched down so that she was at his level. You ready to go, kid? Elijah didn't answer right away. His throat felt tight, and his mind was still replaying the moment she walked away. His mother. Judge Meredith Lawson. He had spent his whole life wondering about her, and when he had finally found her, she had acted like he didn't even exist. Linda gave him a moment before speaking again. Elijah, talk to me. What's going on in your head? He inhaled sharply, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. I've been looking for her my whole life. Linda blinked, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she recovered. You have? Elijah nodded, still staring at the table. I didn't know her name for a long time, but I always felt like if I could just find her, things would make sense. Linda sat back on her heels, listening. Elijah hesitated, then reached into the front pocket of his hoodie. His fingers brushed against something worn and soft, and he slowly pulled it out. A photograph. The edges were frayed, the colors faded from years of handling. It was a picture of a young woman, barely more than a teenager, holding a newborn wrapped in a yellow blanket. The baby. Him. Linda took the photo gently, studying it. Where did you get this? Elijah swallowed hard. My last foster mom gave it to me. Linda's brows lifted slightly. Your last placement? The woman who almost adopted you? Elijah nodded. She had my file. She found this inside. He hesitated before continuing, his fingers twitching slightly. She told me my mom's name, said she looked familiar. So, I started searching. Linda's throat tightened. And you found her? He found her, and she had walked away. Elijah pulled the photo back and stuffed it into his hoodie again, as if it might disappear if he held onto it too long. I thought if I met her, things would be different. His voice cracked. I thought she'd care. Linda exhaled, her heart aching for him. I think she does, Elijah. I just don't think she knows how to deal with this yet. Elijah let out a bitter laugh. Yeah, well, she had 12 years to figure it out. Linda didn't argue, because he wasn't wrong. Meanwhile, Meredith's restless night. Judge Meredith Lawson didn't go home right away. She had left the courthouse in a daze, barely aware of where she was going until she realized she had driven aimlessly for nearly an hour. Her mind was too full, too loud. Eventually, she ended up at her townhouse. But even in the quiet of her living room, she couldn't escape it. That boy's face, his voice, the look in his eyes when she walked away. She poured herself a glass of wine, but after one sip, she set it down, untouched. She was too restless, her stomach twisting. Instead, she grabbed her laptop and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the screen for a long moment before finally typing in a search. Elijah Carter, foster care history. The first few results were news articles about his arrest, the trespassing case, the shocking courtroom revelation. She clenched her jaw and scrolled past them, heart pounding. Then, she found it, a file. Her hands trembled as she clicked on it. Name, Elijah Carter, date of birth, July 14th. Status, ward of the state. She forced herself to read, though every sentence felt like a punch to the gut. Placed in foster care at birth, 5 different homes by the time he was 8, 2 failed adoption placements, 1 shelter stay. Meredith's stomach twisted painfully. She had assumed, no, convinced herself, that he had been adopted quickly, placed with a loving family who had given him everything she couldn't. But that wasn't what happened. He had been left to bounce from home to home, waiting for someone to claim him, and no one ever did. She felt sick. Her eyes caught on a section labeled Behavioral Notes, and she hesitated before clicking. A list of notes from caseworkers popped up. Struggles with trust, difficulty forming attachments, expresses curiosity about biological parents, has asked multiple times if his mother is looking for him. Meredith's breath hitched. He had asked about her for years, and she had never even thought about looking for him. She pushed the laptop away suddenly, as if touching it burned her. Her fingers pressed against her temple as she squeezed her eyes shut. She had built her whole life on the idea that she had done the right thing, but she hadn't. She had abandoned him, and now he was in her courtroom, begging her not to do it again. Meredith pressed her hands flat against the table, trying to steady herself. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a failure, and for the first time in years, she wasn't sure if she could fix it. The news broke overnight. By morning, the media storm was in full force. Headlines flooded the internet and TV screens. Judge accused of abandoning her own son. Legal scandal, Judge Meredith Lawson and the case of Elijah Carter. Justice or conflict of interest, a mother's secret in the courtroom. Meredith Lawson's face was everywhere. Papers, news reports, online articles dissecting every moment of the previous day's trial. Reporters speculated about the ethical conflict of a judge presiding over a case involving a child she allegedly abandoned. Some demanded that she recuse herself, while others picked apart every ruling she had ever made involving youth defendants. Meredith sat in her car outside the courthouse, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. She had spent years building her reputation. Now, in less than 24 hours, it was crumbling. But that wasn't what scared her the most. It was him. Elijah. His voice, his face, the raw hurt in his eyes, it was all she could think about. Her heart pounded as she stepped out of the car, walking past the swarm of reporters camped outside the courthouse steps. Judge Lawson, do you have any comment on the allegations? Are you really Elijah Carter's mother? Why didn't you tell the court? Cameras flashed, voices blurred together, but she kept moving, her jaw tight, her expression unreadable. Once inside, she let out a shaky breath, her body taut with tension. She had a job to do, and today, she had to face him again. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was different. If yesterday had been tense, today felt like standing on the edge of an earthquake. The courtroom was packed, not just with legal professionals, but with reporters, courthouse staff, and curious onlookers who wanted to witness the scandal unfold in real time. Meredith took her seat at the bench, keeping her face neutral. But as soon as she looked down at the defendant's table, her resolve wavered. Elijah was staring at her. But it wasn't like yesterday. There was no uncertainty in his eyes anymore, just hurt and anger. She swallowed hard. Court is back in session. The prosecutor hesitated, glancing at her carefully before speaking. Your Honor, given the unusual circumstances, I think we need to address... There's nothing to address, Meredith cut in sharply, her voice clipped, controlled. We are proceeding with the case as scheduled. Elijah let out a bitter laugh. Right, because it's not personal, right? The courtroom went silent. Meredith tensed, gripping the gavel. Defendant, you will not speak out of turn. But Elijah didn't back down. He stood up from his chair, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. You left me once. His voice was steady, but thick with emotion. Are you going to do it again? The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. Meredith's breath hitched. She should have had an answer. She should have said something, anything to put an end to this. But she couldn't, because she didn't know the answer, because deep down, she was still trying to convince herself that walking away was the right thing to do. The weight of his stare bore down on her, and for the first time in her career, she felt completely powerless. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Linda Foster, seated a few rows behind Elijah, watched the exchange with unreadable eyes. Meredith gripped the bench harder, trying to pull herself together, trying to regain control, but her voice failed her. Elijah shook his head, his expression unreadable. That's what I thought. Another recess, another escape. The second she stepped into her chambers, her composure cracked. She slammed the door shut, locking it behind her before she stumbled toward her desk, her breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Her hands were shaking. She pulled off her judge's robe, suddenly feeling suffocated by it, by what it meant, by what it had cost her. Her chest tightened painfully, and she pressed her palms against the cool surface of the desk, trying to steady herself. But she couldn't. She could still hear him. You left me once. Are you going to do it again? She squeezed her eyes shut. She had spent years believing that she had done what was best for him, that giving him up had given him a better life, but it hadn't. He had spent his childhood being passed from one home to another, searching for something that never came, searching for her. Her breathing grew unsteady, and before she could stop herself, a sob ripped through her throat. She pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to contain it, but it was no use. The walls she had built for years, walls of professionalism, logic, distance, were breaking, and she didn't know how to stop it. She reached for the bottom drawer of her desk again, her fingers fumbling as she pulled it open. The old photograph was still there, the same picture Elijah had, the one of her holding him as a newborn. Her fingers trembled as she ran them over the edges. For years, she had locked this part of her life away, and now it was standing in front of her, demanding to be acknowledged. Her vision blurred with tears. How could she fix this? Could she? She had spent a lifetime convincing herself that this child, her child, was better off without her. And yet, he had stood in front of an entire courtroom and begged her not to walk away again. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, as if she could press the guilt away. But it was too late. She had already lost him once, and if she wasn't careful, she was about to lose him again. The courthouse felt heavier than usual. The echo of hurried footsteps in the corridors, the hushed murmurs of attorneys and clerks. It all faded into background noise as Elijah Carter sat stiffly in a conference room, his small hands clenched in his lap. The room was cold, clinical, impersonal. White walls, a single wooden table, 2 chairs. Nothing about it suggested comfort, yet here he was, waiting for the woman who was supposed to be his mother. He didn't know what to expect. Would she come in and pretend like none of this was real? Would she tell him she had made a mistake? Would she tell him she never wanted him at all? His stomach twisted at the thought, but he straightened his posture, forcing himself to look unaffected. The door clicked open. Elijah's jaw tightened as Judge Meredith Lawson stepped inside. For a moment, neither of them moved. She looked different. Not like the woman who sat at the judge's bench with an unreadable face, cold and detached. No, this version of her looked unsure, almost fragile. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture hesitant. Like she wasn't sure how to approach this moment. Elijah hated that it made his chest ache. She sat down across from him, clasping her hands together on the table. Silence stretched between them. Neither of them knew how to begin. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice flat, guarded. "So, is this the part where you tell me I was a mistake?" Meredith flinched, but he didn't let up. "Or do you just want to pretend none of this happened? Go back to your fancy judge life and forget I exist?" Meredith swallowed hard, her fingers gripping each other so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "No," she said softly. "That's not why I'm here." Elijah leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Then why are you here?" Meredith exhaled slowly. "Because you deserve answers." Elijah scoffed. "Yeah? Took you 12 years to figure that out?" Meredith winced again, but this time she didn't look away. She held his gaze, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite read. Guilt? Regret? Maybe both? "Why did you leave me?" he demanded. "Why didn't you want me?" Meredith closed her eyes for a brief second, as if she could block out the pain in his voice. When she opened them, her face was tight with emotion. "I was 18, she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was scared. My parents, they told me I wasn't ready, that I'd ruin my future if I kept you." Elijah's expression hardened. "So, you just listened to them? You didn't even fight for me?" Meredith let out a shaky breath, her hands still clasped tightly together. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Elijah let out a bitter laugh. "Right, the right thing. You mean leaving me in the system? You mean letting me grow up bouncing from home to home while you became some big-shot judge?" Meredith's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't care," Elijah snapped, his voice cracking. "You never came looking for me, not once, not even to see if I was okay." Meredith's breath hitched and she broke. "Because I was a coward," she choked out. Elijah froze. His mother, the woman who had walked out on him, who had ignored him in court, was crying. "I was afraid," she admitted, "of what I had done, of what I had lost. And if I looked for you, if I found out that you weren't okay, then I'd have to face the truth that I had ruined your life." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hands against her face, her shoulders shaking. Elijah just sat there, his body rigid. He had imagined this moment for so long, confronting her, yelling at her, making her understand what she had done to him. But he hadn't imagined this. He hadn't imagined her breaking apart in front of him. Meredith wiped at her face, trying to regain control, but her voice was still unsteady. "I told myself you were adopted, that you had a good life, that staying away was the best thing I could do for you." Elijah's throat tightened. "You lied to yourself." Meredith nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, I did." Elijah sat there for a long moment, his emotions a tangled mess inside of him. She had hurt him, and no amount of crying could change that. "I wanted you to come find me," he admitted, his voice small. "I used to think maybe one day you'd show up at one of my foster homes, that maybe you'd tell me you made a mistake and wanted me back." Meredith clenched her fists, a fresh wave of tears filling her eyes. "I wish I had." Elijah exhaled, shaking his head. "Yeah, me too." Silence fell again. The weight of years of abandonment, of longing, of hurt sat between them. Finally, Elijah pushed back his chair and stood. "I don't know how to forgive you." Meredith looked up at him, her heart in her throat. "I don't expect you to," she whispered. I just want you to know that I'm here now." Elijah hesitated. For the first time, there was something real in her voice, something that sounded like regret, like a promise. But promises had never meant much to him, not when he had spent his whole life waiting for someone who never came. He swallowed the lump in his throat and turned toward the door. Meredith watched him go, her body trembling. She had told herself she was ready to face him. She wasn't. Because now, for the first time, she understood that he wasn't just the boy she left behind. He was the boy who had learned to live without her. The air in the courtroom was different today, quieter, heavier. The usual murmur of conversation was replaced by a tension that crackled like a storm about to break. Judge Meredith Lawson took her seat at the bench, but for the first time in her career, she didn't feel in control. She had spent the night tossing and turning, her mind racing with Elijah's words, his accusations, his hurt. The weight of 12 years of silence pressed down on her. And now, She had to sit here and pretend that this was just another case. It wasn't. It would never be. She scanned the courtroom, her gaze landing on Elijah. He sat at the defense table, his posture tense, his hands curled into fists on his lap. He refused to look at her. She didn't blame him. Across the room, the prosecutor cleared his throat. Your Honor, given the unique nature of this case, the state is prepared to drop all charges against the defendant. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. A few reporters leaned forward, eager to capture every detail of this unfolding legal and personal drama. Meredith's grip tightened on her gavel. She had known this was coming. She had known from the beginning that Elijah didn't belong here. He wasn't some delinquent. He wasn't a criminal. He was a kid who had spent his life searching for something he was never supposed to find. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to speak. On what grounds? The prosecutor hesitated. In light of the circumstances, it's clear that the defendant had no malicious intent. The state believes pursuing this case would not serve the interests of justice. Justice, a word Meredith had built her entire career on. And yet, when she looked at Elijah, she realized justice had never been on his side. She glanced at his public defender, who simply nodded in agreement. Meredith exhaled sharply. This was the right thing to do. She straightened, forcing her voice to remain firm. The state's motion to drop all charges is granted. The defendant is free to go. A few people in the gallery gasped. Reporters scribbled furiously. But Elijah didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the table as if the words hadn't registered. Meredith's throat tightened. She gripped her gavel, prepared to close the case, prepared to move on. But then Elijah spoke. That's it? His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Meredith's hands stilled. She looked up. Elijah finally turned to face her. His dark brown eyes were fierce, but beneath the anger, she saw something else. Something smaller, more fragile, hurt, disbelief, abandonment. You're just going to let me go? He said, his voice raw. Just like that? Meredith's heart skipped a beat. Elijah? No. He shook his head, his jaw tight. You don't get to act like this is over, like I was just some case on your docket. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Linda Foster, sitting a few rows behind, watched carefully. Meredith swallowed hard. I am dismissing the charges, she said carefully, because you don't belong here. Elijah let out a bitter laugh. Where do I belong then? Silence. Meredith's fingers curled around the bench. She wanted to answer. She wanted to tell him something, anything that might make up for what she had done. But what could she say? That she had made a mistake? That she had spent years convincing herself she had done the right thing? That she had failed him in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend? She wasn't sure there were words big enough to fix this, and Elijah knew it. That's what I thought, he muttered, shoving his chair back as he stood. His lawyer placed a hesitant hand on his shoulder, but Elijah shrugged it off. He turned away, moving toward the doors without looking back. Meredith felt a deep, painful panic rise in her chest. She had just dismissed the charges against him. She had done the right thing. So, why did it feel like she had just lost him all over again? Her fingers twitched around the gavel. She could end this here. She could let him walk away, let him disappear into whatever life he had built without her. She had already done it once, but something in her refused to do it again. Elijah! Her voice wasn't the judge's voice. It was raw, personal, unsteady. Elijah stopped. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned. Meredith stood from the bench. For the first time in years, she wasn't looking down at him from a position of authority. She was just a mother facing the son she had abandoned. You're right, she admitted. This isn't over. The courtroom went silent. Elijah just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Meredith's hands curled into fists at her sides, forcing herself to be braver than she had been 12 years ago. I don't know how to fix this, she said honestly. I don't even know if I can. Elijah's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't trust himself to speak. Meredith took a careful step forward. But if you'll let me, I want to try. Elijah swallowed. His shoulders rose and fell with a shaky breath. And for the first time, he didn't look angry, just uncertain. I don't know if I can trust you, he admitted. Meredith's throat tightened. I don't blame you. He hesitated, shifting on his feet. Linda Foster watched from her seat, her lips pressing together like she was holding back emotion. The whole courtroom seemed to be waiting for Elijah's response. Finally, he spoke. I don't know what I want from you. Meredith's chest ached. That's okay. Elijah exhaled, looking at her for a long, heavy moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. Meredith stood frozen, her hands trembling. The courtroom was silent. Then, Linda Foster stood. She walked past Meredith, stopping just long enough to murmur, "That was a start." Then she followed Elijah out the door. Meredith let out a slow breath. For the first time in 12 years, she had said the words she had been too afraid to say. And now, she just had to pray it wasn't too late. The first time Meredith Lawson called, Elijah let it go to voicemail. The second time, he stared at the screen until it went dark. By the third time, he picked up. He didn't say anything at first, just held the phone to his ear, waiting. Finally, her voice came through, hesitant but steady. Elijah, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you, but I'd like to see you, if that's something you'd want. A long silence stretched between them. Elijah bit his lip, debating whether he should just hang up. But for some reason he didn't. He thought about her standing in that courtroom, telling him she wanted to try. He thought about the way her voice had cracked, about how she hadn't run this time. So instead of hanging up, he said, I guess. It wasn't much, but it was something. Their first meeting. They met at a small diner on the edge of town. It was neutral territory, a place that didn't belong to either of them. When Elijah walked in, Meredith was already there, sitting in a booth near the window, stirring her coffee even though it was probably cold by now. For a second, he thought about turning around and walking right back out. But then she looked up, and in her eyes, he didn't see the judge. He saw someone who was just as uncertain as he was. So, he walked over and slid into the booth across from her. You like pancakes? She asked, her attempt at something casual. Elijah shrugged. I guess? Meredith gave a small, almost nervous nod and signaled for the waitress. It was awkward. Neither of them knew how to do this, how to have a normal conversation when there was 12 years of silence between them. But slowly, the words started coming. Nothing big at first, just small things. How's school? Okay, I guess. Do you like it? Not really. She didn't push, she just listened. And for the first time, Elijah let her. Slow progress. Over the next few weeks, they met again. At a park where they sat on a bench, watching people walk their dogs while Elijah kicked at the gravel. At a bookstore, where Meredith asked what he liked to read, and he shrugged, saying he didn't really read much. At a basketball court, where she stood at the sidelines, watching as he played a pickup game with some kids from his group home. Each time, the conversations got a little less tense, a little less forced. Still, it wasn't perfect. There were days when Elijah would shut down completely, refusing to say more than 2 words. There were moments when he felt like walking away and never coming back. And there were times when anger bubbled back up inside of him, making him lash out. You don't get to just show up and act like this is normal. I know. You think this makes up for everything? No. Then why are you even trying? Meredith's voice was always soft, steady when she answered. Because I don't want to make the same mistake twice. The basketball game that changed everything. One night, Meredith showed up somewhere she hadn't been invited. Elijah was playing in a youth league basketball game at his community center. It wasn't a big game, just something small, something he played in to burn off energy, to feel like he was good at something. But when he glanced at the bleachers, he froze. She was there, sitting in the middle row, hands folded in her lap, watching him. For a second, he felt embarrassed, like maybe the other kids would notice, like maybe they'd ask who she was and he wouldn't know how to answer. But then the game started, and he shoved the thoughts away. He ran down the court, passed the ball, got into position. And then he made a shot, a perfect, clean shot. And in the bleachers, Meredith clapped. Not loud, not like some over-enthusiastic parent, but just enough. Just enough that he heard it over the sound of sneakers squeaking against the gym floor. Something in his chest twisted, something tight, something unfamiliar. After the game, as he was walking out, she was waiting by the door. For once, she didn't ask him how he was. She didn't push for conversation. She just said, "You played really well." And for some reason, he believed her. understanding each other. The next time they met, Elijah brought a basketball with him. They were at the park, and for once, instead of sitting awkwardly on the bench, he bounced the ball against the pavement, staring at her. "You any good?" he asked. Meredith smiled, shaking her head. "Not even a little." Elijah smirked. "Guess I'll have to teach you then." Meredith nodded. "Guess so." He passed her the ball, and for the first time, something between them shifted. It wasn't fixed, it wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Meredith Lawson sat in her office, staring at a stack of legal documents spread out before her. She had spent her entire career navigating the law, but now, for the first time, she was on the other side of it. She had spent the past few weeks doing everything she could to reconnect with Elijah, to prove to him that she wasn't going to disappear again. But now, she had to ask herself a difficult question. Was it enough? She sighed, rubbing her temples as she looked up at the attorney sitting across from her. "What are my options?" The attorney, a middle-aged woman named Susan Patel, pursed her lips. "Legally, you don't have any parental rights over Elijah. You relinquished those when he was a baby. He's still a ward of the state." Meredith swallowed the lump in her throat. She had known that, but hearing it out loud still hurt. "But," Susan continued, "if Elijah wanted it, you could petition to become his legal guardian." Meredith sat back in her chair, letting those words settle. Legal guardian. It sounded so official, so permanent. Susan studied her carefully. "You'd have to prove that you're capable of providing him with a stable home. And given your history—" "My history," Meredith repeated bitterly, already knowing what was coming. Susan hesitated. "The court might have concerns about whether reintroducing you into his life is in his best interest." Meredith let out a slow breath. "That's what I'm trying to figure out too." Because the truth was, she wasn't sure. She had abandoned him once. What if she failed him again? Working with Linda. The next day she met with Linda Foster. If there was anyone who knew what was best for Elijah, it was her. They sat in Linda's small office at the community center, surrounded by piles of case files and overstuffed bookshelves. "He's been through a lot," Linda said, sighing as she leaned back in her chair. "You can't just decide you want to be in his life and expect him to trust you overnight." "I know," Meredith admitted. "Do you?" Linda's voice was calm but firm. "Because, Meredith, this isn't just about you wanting to make things right. It's about what Elijah needs." Meredith nodded, feeling the weight of that truth settle on her shoulders. "That's why I need your help. I don't just want to be in his life. I want to do it the right way. I want him to have real support." Linda studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "He needs therapy, stability, a support system that won't fall apart on him." Meredith's heart twisted painfully. "I want to give him that," she said quietly. Linda sighed, crossing her arms. "Then let's start small." A conversation that changed everything. One night, after another basketball game, Meredith and Elijah sat on the hood of her car outside the community center. The night air was cool, crisp, and for once, there was no tension between them. Elijah was still sweaty from the game, idly spinning a basketball between his hands. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the occasional headlights pass down the street. Then, Elijah spoke. His voice was quiet, hesitant. "Do you think we could ever be a real family?" Meredith's breath caught in her throat. She turned to look at him, but he wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the road ahead, like he was afraid of her answer. She swallowed hard, blinking back the sudden sting of tears. "I don't know what the future holds," she said honestly, "but I do know one thing." Finally, Elijah glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Meredith's voice was thick with emotion as she continued. "I'm not walking away this time." Elijah held her gaze for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. The courtroom looked different this time. The last time Elijah Carter had sat in this room, he had felt small, angry, lost. He had felt like a kid who didn't belong anywhere. But today was different. He sat next to Meredith Lawson, his mother. Not his judge. Not just some woman he had searched for his whole life. His mother. Meredith's hands were folded in her lap, her back straight, but he could see the way her fingers trembled slightly. She was nervous. And honestly, so was he. The judge, an older man with kind eyes, glanced between them before shuffling through some paperwork. Miss Lawson, I see you've petitioned for legal guardianship of Elijah Carter. Both parties are in agreement? Meredith cleared her throat. Yes, Your Honor. Elijah nodded. Yeah. The judge smiled. Well then, let's make this official. The moment that changed everything. The proceedings weren't long, just a few signatures, a few formalities. But Elijah felt every second of it, because this wasn't just paperwork, it was a choice Meredith was making, to be his mother, to stay, and a choice he was making too. When the judge finally spoke again, his voice was warm. Congratulations, Miss Lawson. Elijah, you're officially home. The words hit Elijah harder than he expected. Home. He had never really had one before, not one that stayed. He looked at Meredith, and for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, this time was different. Outside the courthouse. The steps of the courthouse were just as crowded as before. Reporters had gathered, though their cameras weren't flashing in the same frantic way they had months ago. But Meredith didn't pay them any attention. She was too focused on Elijah. They stood side by side at the top of the steps, both hesitating for just a second. The past few months had been hard, messy, imperfect. And the road ahead? It wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, hope outweighed the fear. Meredith exhaled slowly, then turned to Elijah. This is just the beginning. Elijah looked up at her. For the first time in a long time, he let himself smile. It was small, just a flicker. But it was real. Yeah, he said softly. I think we're gonna be okay. And with that, they walked down the courthouse steps together, side by side, mother and son. Finally home. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. See you in the next one.